Every winter, 50 million people climb onto a snowmobile and go. They cross frozen lakes in Finland. They haul supplies through blizzards in Alaska. They race at 150 miles per hour across groomed tracks in Quebec. And almost none of them know the name of the man who made it possible. His son died in a snowstorm because the roads were impassable. And that death, that single preventable death in rural Quebec in 1934, built an industry worth billions. The man was not an engineer. He had no degree, no government backing, no corporate sponsor. He was a farm boy from a village of 900 people who refused to accept that winter could not be beaten. His name was Joseph-Armand Bombardier. Canada built its entire north on what he invented. Then it handed his name to the world and forgot to keep it. February 1934, Valcourt, Quebec. A blizzard has been building for days, stacking snow against doors, burying roads under drifts that no vehicle could push through. The kind of storm that reminds you how far you are from everything. Joseph-Armand Bombardier is 27 years old. His son Yvon is 2. The boy develops appendicitis. In a city, that is a frightening diagnosis. In Valcourt, in February, in a blizzard, it is something worse. Without surgery, the infection will spread. The clock starts the moment the symptoms appear. The nearest hospital is 25 miles away. The roads are gone. There is no vehicle on Earth, not in Valcourt, not in the surrounding counties, not in the whole of rural Quebec, that can move through what the storm has left behind. 25 miles might as well be 1,000. Yvon dies before they reach help. There are no records of what Bombardier said that night. No letters survive that describe what the hours after felt like. What is known is what came next. Not grief that paralyzed, grief that built. Bombardier was already a mechanic, already obsessed with the problem of snow travel in a way that went beyond any practical calculation. He had been experimenting in his garage for years. Wooden frames, propeller drives, tracked wheels turning through slush and ice, each attempt failing in a different way, each failure pointing towards something better. The death of his son did not create that obsession. It sharpened it into something that could not be set aside, could not be deferred, could not wait for a better season or a more convenient year. Every vehicle he builds from this point forward is an answer to that night. That is the thing that gets lost when this story is told as an invention story, as a business story, as a chapter in Canadian industrial history. It was not any of those things first. It was a father who watched his child die because the road between his house and the hospital was impassable, and who decided, with a clarity that only that kind of loss can produce, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure the road would never stop anyone again. He would succeed. He would build machines that transformed how an entire country moved through its coldest months. He would create an industry that 50 million people depend on today. And Canada would let him do all of it alone, would use him when it needed him, would walk away when it did not, would forget his name long before the world had even learned it. That is the story. It starts here, in the snow, in 1934, with a child who should not have died. Bombardier was born in 1907 in Valcourt, a farming village tucked into Quebec's eastern townships, far enough from Montreal that the city might as well have been another country. His father was a farmer. The land around Valcourt was flat, cold, and demanding. There was nothing about the place that suggested it would one day put its name on 50 million machines. He was 13 years old when he took apart his father's car engine, not because anything was wrong with it, because he needed to know how it worked. He reassembled it. It ran. His father was not pleased. Bombardier did not stop. There was no university in his future, no engineering program, no formal credential of any kind. What he had was a garage, a tolerance for failure, and a mind that could not leave a mechanical problem alone. By his early 20s, he was running a small repair shop on Valcourt's main street. Repairs, engine work, whatever people brought through the door. He fixed things. He also kept building things nobody had asked for. The Canadian winter had been isolating rural communities for as long as anyone could remember, and nobody in authority had decided this was a problem worth addressing. Roads that were passable in October became walls of packed snow by December. Entire towns went quiet. Supply chains broke. People stayed where they were and waited for spring. This was considered normal. Bombardier did not consider it normal. He had been experimenting with snow travel for years before his son was born, before Yvon died, before grief gave the obsession its final direction. Wooden propeller sleds, rear-wheel drive modifications, tracked systems built from scavenged parts. Each one failed. Each failure was more instructive than the last. By 1935, he had something that worked. The B7, a 7-passenger enclosed snow vehicle, built on a sprocket wheel and rubber track system he had designed himself, powered by a rear-drive engine, assembled in the same garage where he had been fixing other people's tractors for a decade. It was not elegant. It was not fast. But it moved through snow that stopped everything else. That was the only specification that mattered. The patent came in 1937. Production followed. The B7 entered the world not with a press release or a government ceremony, but with the quiet momentum of something that simply worked when nothing else did. While Bombardier was arriving at this solution alone, in a village of 900 people, the federal government in Ottawa had not commissioned a single study, allocated a single dollar, or acknowledged in any formal way that winter isolation in rural Canada was a national problem. One man noticed. The country did not. The B7 was not a toy. It was not a sport. It was not a lifestyle product waiting for the right marketing campaign. It was a working vehicle built for people who had no other option, and those people found it immediately. Rural Quebec changed fast. Ambulance runs that had been impossible became routine. A child with a fever in a remote parish could now reach a hospital. A woman in labor no longer had to wait for a thaw. Mail reached isolated communities through January and February for the first time in their history. Schools that had been effectively closed for 5 months a year began running through the winter. The roads were still buried. The machines no longer cared. Mining operations in northern Ontario and Quebec adopted the larger B12 for supply transport into territory that had previously been unreachable between freeze and thaw. Lumber camps, prospecting operations, trap lines that had required weeks of preparation to reach in winter. All of them changed because one man in Valcourt had solved the problem that made them dangerous. The Catholic Church was among his earliest and most consistent customers. Priests in rural Quebec used Bombardier's vehicles to reach isolated parishes through the winter months. Communities that had gone without religious services for entire seasons, cut off not by distance but by snow, were suddenly reachable again. The church did not buy these machines because they were impressive. They bought them because without them, people were unreachable. That detail alone measures the scale of what Bombardier had done. He had not invented a convenience. He had closed a gap that an entire country had simply accepted as permanent. And Ottawa said nothing. No procurement contracts arrived from the federal government. No research grants. No letter from a minister acknowledging what a private citizen in a Quebec village had accomplished at his own expense after the death of his child. Canada had a winter isolation problem that affected millions of people across the north, across the prairies, across rural Ontario and Quebec. A man with no degree and no government support had solved it. The government's response was silence. This is not a minor detail in the margins of Bombardier's story. It is the story. Because the silence of 1937 and 1938 and 1939 is the same silence that echoes through every chapter that follows. The same government that would come knocking when it needed him, that would impose conditions and cancel contracts and walk away without acknowledgement, was already establishing its position. Bombardier was useful. He was not valued. There is a difference. Canada would spend the next 3 decades making sure he understood it. When the war came, the Canadian military did not arrive in Valcourt with gratitude. They arrived with urgency. There is a difference. For years, the government in Ottawa had watched Bombardier build snow vehicles that transformed rural life across the country, had seen the church buying them, the mining companies buying them, the ambulance services buying them, and had found no reason to get involved. Then the war started. Then Allied forces needed to move through snow. Then the calculation changed. Not because anyone in Ottawa had reassessed Bombardier's contribution, because they had no other option. He had the machines. He had the factory. He had the knowledge that nobody else had built because nobody else had bothered. The Penguin was the result. A military snow vehicle designed and produced in Valcourt for Canadian and Allied forces operating in winter conditions. Bombardier retooled his factory, scaled his production, and delivered. The same man the government had ignored for a decade became, almost overnight, an essential national asset. The contracts came with conditions, price controls set by bureaucrats who had never built anything, design requirements imposed by committees that did not understand what the machines needed to do, oversight that slowed production and added costs that Bombardier absorbed, delays generated by government paperwork that had no relationship to the urgency the military claimed to feel. The factory that had been built on independent problem-solving was now subject to the full weight of wartime procurement administration. It nearly broke the company. Not enemy action, not material shortages. Government management. Bombardier delivered anyway. The machines went to the front. The war moved forward. Then it ended. The contracts were canceled. No transition support. No funding to convert the scaled-up factory back to civilian production. No study of what the government's wartime demands had cost the company and whether that cost deserved acknowledgement. No Order of Canada. No parliamentary motion. No minister stood in the House of Commons and said the name of the man in Valcourt who had spent the war building what the country needed. Bombardier rebuilt the civilian business alone, the same way he had built everything else, without asking for help that was not coming. The pattern by this point was fully established. In peacetime, Ottawa ignored him. In wartime, Ottawa found him indispensable, squeezed him, and managed him with the confidence of people who had contributed nothing to what they were now controlling. In victory, Ottawa walked away. 3 times the government had defined its relationship with Joseph-Armand Bombardier. 3 times the answer was the same. He was useful. He was not valued. And when the need passed, he was forgotten. quickly and completely, as though he had never been there at all. By the late 1950s, Bombardier had spent 2 decades building vehicles for necessity, enclosed transports for miners and priests and mail carriers, machines that justified themselves in emergencies, in blizzards, in the kind of conditions that made movement a matter of survival rather than choice. He understood that market completely. He had built it from nothing. What he began working on next was different, smaller, lighter, a single or 2-passenger machine designed not for a mining company or a church or an ambulance service, but for the individual moving through snow alone. Trappers, hunters, prospectors working remote claim sites, people for whom a large enclosed vehicle was too expensive and too much, but who still needed to move through winter terrain that stopped everything else. The name he gave it was Ski Dog, a working animal replaced by a machine, practical, functional, unglamorous. Exactly the kind of name a man who had spent his life building things for necessity would choose. A printing error on an early promotional brochure changed dog to do. Nobody caught it in time. Nobody corrected it afterward. The Ski-Doo entered the world with a name its inventor had not chosen, and that name would become one of the most recognized in the history of winter sport. It launched in 1959. The price was $900. In the first year, 225 units sold. Bombardier looked at that number and considered the possibility that he had misjudged the market. He had spent his life building vehicles for people who had no alternative. He had not fully anticipated what would happen when people discovered they wanted one. The market found itself, and then it could not be contained. By 1966, 8,000 units a year. By 1970, more than 200,000. The Ski-Doo had stopped being a work vehicle and become something Bombardier had never designed it to be: a sport, a pastime, a culture, an industry. Racing circuits organized themselves around machines that had not existed 15 years earlier. Clubs formed. Trail networks expanded across entire provinces. Tourism economies built themselves on top of something one man had designed for trappers in a Quebec garage. The industry Bombardier created reached $4 billion in value before the decade was out. 100 competitors entered the market within 5 years of the Ski-Doo's success. Not one of them was Canadian. Polaris came from Roseau, Minnesota. Arctic Cat from Thief River Falls, Minnesota. Yamaha from Japan. Bombardier had proved the concept, built the demand, and established the manufacturing knowledge. The companies that flooded in to profit from it came from everywhere, except the country that had produced the man who started it. American media covered the snowmobile boom as an American story. Minnesota brands received the sponsorships, the magazine covers, the racing profiles. For decades, casual consumers in the United States assumed the snowmobile had been invented in the American Midwest. The name Bombardier meant nothing to them. The name Valcourt meant less. Joseph-Armand Bombardier died in February 1964, 5 years after the Ski-Doo launch, at 56 years old. The industry he had created was still accelerating. He never saw 200,000 units a year. He never saw the racing circuits, the international trails, the cultural phenomenon his printing error had produced. He built the foundation and did not live to stand on it. His family took control and expanded aggressively. Sea-Doo, aerospace, rail transit systems, the acquisition of Learjet, Bombardier Inc. became one of the largest transportation companies on Earth, building trains for London, aircraft for airlines across 6 continents. transit systems for cities from New York to Kuala Lumpur. The company that began with a grieving father and a garage in rural Quebec was now a global industrial giant. And the machine that had started everything was increasingly a footnote in the annual report. In 2003, Bombardier Inc. sold its entire recreational products division to a private equity consortium. Ski-Doo, Sea-Doo, and the related brands became BRP, Bombardier Recreational Products, a legally separate company with no ownership connection to Bombardier Inc. The name on the snowmobile was now a licensing arrangement, not a family legacy. And then even that ended. The Ski-Doo today does not carry the Bombardier name on the vehicle itself. Legally prohibited, commercially severed. The machine that a grieving father built in a Quebec garage, the machine that proved the concept, created the industry, and funded the corporate expansion that followed, is no longer allowed to carry his name. There is no statue of Joseph-Armand Bombardier in Ottawa, no federal museum, no national commemorative program that bears his name. The town of Valcourt, population 2,500, built the only museum dedicated to his work. A town smaller than most city neighborhoods did what the federal government never bothered to do. He was inducted into the Canadian Business Hall of Fame, posthumously, decades after his death. After the industry he created had already reshaped the economies of half a dozen countries. Henry Ford has a museum in Dearborn, Michigan, that draws more than 1 million visitors a year. The name Ford is shorthand for an era, a country, a way of life. Joseph-Armand Bombardier has a museum in a village that most Canadians have never visited and could not find on a map. He did not invent something smaller than what Ford invented. He solved a problem that defined the conditions of life across the entire northern half of this country. Canada never made him a household name. Today, BRP employs 23,000 people. The Ski-Doo holds roughly 35% of the global snowmobile market. The snowmobile opened the Canadian North to year-round economic life, changed how Indigenous communities moved across the Arctic, and enabled the resource extraction that funded a generation of Canadian prosperity. The town of Valcourt, population 2,500, built the only museum in his name. Ottawa never did. Every time a child rides a snowmobile for the first time, in Finland, in Alaska, in Hokkaido, they are riding something a grieving father built alone in Quebec in 1937. His name was Joseph-Armand Bombardier. Canada never quite decided what to do with him.